Hey my friend, today I want to share a really interesting concept with you, and that is the concept of the psychedelic self, and how that concept might help us to integrate our psychedelic experiences to a greater extent. Hey, I'm Virgo, I'm a psychedelic integration coach, and actually in one of my sessions with one of my clients, I remembered this concept. As he was sharing about his recent psychedelic experience and how much gratitude and love he felt, and that he wants to integrate that gratitude into his own life. And that reminded me of some of my stories of psychedelic trips, where it feels like my psychedelic self has certain qualities. It shows me a certain potential version of myself, which I might be able then to actualize in my day-to-day life afterwards. Because my ordinary sense of self might not be as grateful, might not be as happy or as playful or whatever qualities I assert to that psychedelic self. And as I've been journeying more and more over 9 years, I recognized that there's a pattern emerging in the psychedelic space. That if there is a sense of self still, we're going to get to that in the end as well, it is a different set of qualities, a different set of self, which we might call psychedelic self or shamanic persona, which is quite distinct from our usual self. So this is what I want to get into. What is the psychedelic self? How might we be able to use that concept to help us integrate? And also certain nuances that I want to get into, then limitations of this concept and dangers in using this concept and the paradox that we're running into. So stay tuned for that. I'm going to share that at the end of the video. So the psychedelic self. What is the psychedelic self? Basically, it's a version of you that arises in your psychedelic sessions. It's an own discrete, almost like a sub-personality, even though it's still you. But it feels like it does have kind of like a different unique viewpoint or unique qualities that are arising. It might also be considered as your psychedelic alter ego or your tripping self or your psychedelic identity. Or as Christopher Beige sometimes calls it in his book LSD and the Mind of the Universe, great book, we're going to get into that, is shamanic persona. I like that concept as well. And it can differ in many different ways, some like very practical ways that are deeply just related to the intake of the substance and the neurochemical changes in our brain is our sense of time or our sense of balance is changed. But sometimes even our characteristic, our sense of humor, we might feel a little bit more heart-centered instead of mind-centered. We might take on a different worldview, a bigger picture perspective. And maybe even our taste in music or food is changing. And even our feelings or our handwriting can change. And taking time to integrate our psychedelic self can increase our harmony in our life. Because I find it brings about a certain sense of integrity as I merge my psychedelic self with my ordinary self. As my psychedelic self feels almost like more true, more authentic, more real than my ordinary self, which is with this full default mode network in on processing, the identification with the ego mind, with the body. All of these layers are kind of like layering this, what feels like my true nature, my authentic self, which is brought to the open in psychedelic sessions. So how do we go about this when we want to integrate our psychedelic self and into our ordinary self? We kind of like, for me it's a process, as I said, of merging those two into one. So that basically my whole life becomes a psychedelic odyssey. There's no difference between me in my ordinary state and me in my psychedelic state. And this is what the process has been like for me. Over the years, I kind of like observed myself and also some clients of mine become more psychedelic. If it's hard with the wording, but my day-to-day self becomes more psychedelic in a sense that it is more loose. And I want to give some concrete examples here as well on which you might reflect on, because there's 5 six different distinct areas in our life in which we can reflect upon how we want to integrate psychedelic experiences. I often like to say that psychedelic integration is nothing else but life itself. A deeper kind of like exploration you can find in my free workbook, 5 Steps to Integrate Your Psychedelic Insights into Daily Life. You can download it for free. Link is in the video description. And in there, I talk about these different influences that we have. We have the physical, mental, emotional, social, environmental, and spiritual influencer. And I recognize that in all of these areas, there is insight in psychedelic space that is arising that I can take and integrate and use in my day-to-day life. So for example, in the physical, oftentimes the mushrooms are showing me that I really want to stretch more. Let's see, oh my God, I can't, it's horrible. So, and mushrooms are showing me all the time that my mushroom self, it loves to stretch. You know, there can even be different selves emerging in different substances. It's quite an interesting and fascinating thing, you know. And also, especially on LSD, towards the middle and the end, I can just eat fruit. So there's a certain sense of awareness around what food really resonates with my body and what I really want to take in. Not the processed foods, I don't like to eat weird processed foods. I like fresh, raw fruits and vegetables, or really nice cooked meal or whatever. So there's an awareness on the physical and the actual practical physical level that I want to stretch more. I want to eat certain foods and avoid other foods. Just like a very practical example. On the mental level, it gets a bit more interesting. On the mental, I feel it's about a certain understanding of reality that is arising, from which I can derive a certain sense of meeting the world, meeting with appearances in reality. And that meeting is kind of like characterized by certain attitudes that I take on. So a common example in psychedelic space is to surrender, you know, to let go and surrender, to almost like go with the flow. And I sense that there is a certain mindset to that, a certain way of thinking about things that allow these attitudes of flow, of surrender, also of courage, of meeting the fear, and of responsibility and commitment are arising in psychedelic space. And to pick one or two of these, for example, the sensation of surrender, to just go more with the flow of life. Psychedelic self can show that to you, how that's possible, and then you can take that into your daily life, merge that with your ordinary self. So your ordinary self becomes more able to surrender into each and every moment. On the emotional, it's also quite interesting, as in psychedelic space there's an openness sometimes to, for example, digest emotions, to not instantly go into our habitual response of grabbing our phone, distracting ourselves, or doing some like unhealthy stuff to avoid uncomfortable emotions. But psychedelic self is saying, we might be able to process and digest and receive all of the emotions that are arising within our being. Social example, we're done with the examples almost, but social is also a really interesting one. I noticed for myself, my psychedelic self, in social interactions, especially with LSD or even with ayahuasca, it's more playful. So integrating a sense of playfulness into my ordinary sense of self has been one of the biggest insights in regards to merging psychedelic and ordinary self. So in social interactions, I become more playful, more humorous, more lighthearted and loose and relaxed. And also, I do set more boundaries, because recognizing my own authentic desires in the moment and my own sense of where I want to be and what I want to do and with whom I want to do it, I'm more able to set boundaries as well, flow out of certain situations or environments into other environments. That counts for environments, for example, as well. I don't feel good in the forest anymore, so I flow into the beach or whatever, right? I don't feel good in the city anymore, so I flow into the mountains. And so I have this intuition, this sense of intuition on what's truly important to me in the moment. And the spiritual, it gets a bit more lofty. We're not gonna get into that whole back right here, but you get the sense, right? You get the sense that in psychedelic space there's a sense of authenticity, of realness opening up, which we then might identify with as a psychedelic self, a tripping self, and our ordinary self of sense of self does not have these qualities. At least not to the degree that our psychedelic self is able to live that out and embody that. So, and then our job becomes to embody that, to take these insights, to take these realizations, to take this glimpsed potential and actually embody it on a day-to-day basis, on a moment-to-moment basis in our own life. And then the question becomes, how? Okay, how are we doing this? Like, how can I do this? And there's an infinite array of potential practices in what we call psychedelic integration. I could go on for hours and hours, but I just want to go into two very important, big, broad categories right here. So one, maybe three. Okay, let's take one is to reflect. So be aware of the differences between everyday and psychedelic self. And then basically question and explore and especially maybe journal about it to gain clarity around what it is exactly that you want to integrate, right? It's not necessary to integrate it all at once and from one day to the next expect that you're going to be your whole psychedelic self integrated in ordinariness and it's completely merged. No, just take one or two little qualities or insights from the psychedelic self and journal about them, gain clarity around what that means, and then ask yourself, what do I have to do in order to integrate that more, in order to embody that more, and start a process of contemplation. Think about it, feel about it. And then basically there's these two big categories that we can go into. One is take action, and the other is build habits. So taking action means to, I would say, take bigger kind of like action steps that you might want to take in order to align yourself with your psychedelic self. So plain simple example for myself, I haven't fully integrated it. Psychedelic self and also ordinary self, it likes sunshine. So I might want to take a big action of moving to a place where I'm able to have more sunshine throughout the year. See, practical thing. Or another kind of like big action step could be is that I want to take more time to process my emotions properly and digest them properly. So once a week or once every 2 weeks, I take the action to go to a breathwork session. And instead of going into big psychedelic journeys, I continue on the emotional processing through taking on a practice of breathwork and go into these 40 to 60 minute sessions. Very practical action step. Action step also could be to have a conversation, with your partner, with a friend, where you feel a certain sense of misalignment around your relationship and you have a tough conversation. That's an action step. So you got to get out there. You got to get a bit uncomfortable. You got to take action basically in order to embody these insights. It's fine and good to have them and to glimpse that potential or think about them. But if you're not actually doing anything with it and you're not taking action, then basically life is not changing to a great extent, to a significant extent. And then the second aspect of that is basically to build habits. To start small and start learning about how to build habits. What do you actually want to do? And how do you want to build that up? So simple ones. I always like to return to the simple ones. Sitting in meditation, having a sense of meditation practice. It's a very holistic practice of mental, emotional, environmental, spiritual. And go at all these categories. Improve the diet. Go read some stuff, go to social events where you resonate with people. It's all these little practices of building up a certain habit within yourself. it can even go into the mental kind of like attitudes. For example, I made it a habit now to, as often as possible throughout the day, check in with myself, be aware, and then follow my highest excitement. That's what the psychedelic showed me. Psychedelic self says it's beautiful and life is going to unfold magically, like a magical fairy tale, if I just follow my excitement in every moment. I see that when I'm at festivals at the most, you know, it's like I'm just flowing with my excitement. I do what I really feel like is my highest excitement in the moment, and then I meet the most magical people, the most magical things happen, just like synchronicities appear all of a sudden. So following my excitement, I want to make that a habit in my day-to-day life, in ordinary life, even when I'm working, even when I'm earning money, whatever, you know. So that's a crucial habit, a mental habit that I'm trying to implement and integrate. Good, all clear on how you're going to integrate this and how that's possible to merge psychedelic self with ordinary self? Good. Then let's move on to the nuances, the pitfalls, and the paradoxes that we're going to go into. The promised part that I feel is important to mention as a caveat here at the end. Definitely. So one aspect of this is what I've read in the book LSD and the Mind of the Universe. I said Chris Beige. He has a section at the end that says what dies and is reborn. So he's talking about these cycles of death and rebirth. So when our sense of self is dying, there seems to be another sense of self that is born, that is reborn in the psychedelic space even itself. So when the ego, for example, the identification with the body-mind is dying, there is a sense of what he calls the species ego emerging. You know? And then as we develop into deeper and deeper space of our spiritual practice and in psychedelic journeying, that species ego has to die. You know, I'm a human being, self-identification with being one with the species. And then what is emerging is what he calls the shamanic persona, you know, and eventually that psychedelic self, that shamanic persona that is emerging in psychedelic space, which allows us to navigate the world, even that sense of self has to die in a certain point if we progress onto ever deeper layers into this infinity. And then he's basically describing in his book that it takes on cosmic layers, and it's kind of like the selfhood of the shamanic persona and the selfhood of that individual identity of even a psychedelic self is transcendent into an identification with ever more complete oneness. And ever more complete dissolution into the one, into infinity, into what some of the Buddhist literatures also call shunyata, or no self. You know? So that's kind of like one caveat and nuance, that if we really want to progress onto ever more deeper layers into our true nature, we gotta be letting go of our psychedelic self at one point. So it's almost like some of the first stages allow us just to notice this very relative domain of, okay, there are some characteristics that I might want to integrate. And then it goes into ever more transcendent layers of that. So whole topic in and of itself, but important to mention, not to get attached to the psychedelic self, not to identify too much with the psychedelic self even. And then the second nuance and the paradox that from a certain sense of non-dual perspective we could say we're running into is that oftentimes what I see with my clients and even in my psychedelic journeying in the first couple of years, there is a sense of judgment that was developing. A sense of judgment of the psychedelic self as being more true, more authentic, more real, superior, or preferred to my ordinary sense of self. So this creates the illusion and reinforces the illusion of a separate self, of an ego self. you know. And it's a very nuanced kind of like delicate balancing act and paradox, because we do know the neurochemical changes of the reduction of the default mode network, you know, which is basically the sense of self. So there is a real kind of like thing to it, but from certain traditional angles, this sense of self, this ordinary sense of self, this identification with the ego mind, it is an illusion in the first place. So to even make the distinction between a psychedelic self, which is more real, more authentic, more true than our ordinary self, which is less real, less authentic, less true, it creates a division between those two and even reinforces the illusion of separation between those two. So that's kind of like really, really interesting to contemplate, you know, to see, are we able to remove that judgment and even merge the sensation that psychedelic self is better or worse than ordinary self? Because when we resolve that judgment, then they automatically merge into one whole, into one being, and the ordinary self becomes the realized self, because it is, you know, it actually is the realized self. There's nothing that we're working towards anymore. And that's what the paradox of what I call in my psychedelic actualization framework, the dance of detached appreciation. You know, in our ordinary sense of self, what I try to do is not to attach to any appearance whatsoever, but to appreciate it fully. And any appearance is including my sense of self, my sense of thoughts, my sense of identification, my sense of ego mind. To detach from that, but appreciate its mechanisms and its arising fully. I went into my 3-hour-long presentation. You can watch that one right here. Highly recommend it. It's one of the deepest presentations where I go a bit deeper into this non-dual perspective that is merging the real and the illusionary into one whole. See, and it's a very, very interesting dance that we're dancing right here with these words of illusion and real. You know, the distinction of unreal or less authentic and more authentic or more real. You know, true or untrue nature. Because from a certain perspective, that is the case. You know, we feel like psychedelic self is more authentic or more real or more me than ordinary sense of self, which is more displaying or embodying a version of myself that I don't prefer. But in its deepest sense, you cannot escape your true nature. Everything you are is true. You know, everything, this what you are right here, right now, in this state of consciousness, this is true. This is your true nature. This is as true as it gets. So, and to realize that directly is kind of like the direct path to that merging, to the realization, to not even create the distinction between those two in the first place and just dance in this wholeness of it all. And certain attitudes that I found helped me to do that, and to then also approach this dance between trying to be more authentic while recognizing that I'm already as true as it gets, is kindness. Remove the judgment by cultivating a sense of curiosity. Dance, see it as a dance, and be kind to yourself. Be compassionate to yourself and others, to this development of this journey. And have patience. Patience in all of these things, in taking the action, in journaling your insights, in merging the psychedelic self with the ordinary self, and in cultivating these habits. So that's about it. If you're curious and want some support on your journey of actually doing that, of merging psychedelic self and ordinary self, then I do offer psychedelic integration coaching. Link is in the video description. Hope you enjoyed that one. It just spontaneously arose, this idea. And yeah, much love to you all. See you in the next one.